Lonely rancher marries fat young widow for a bet. On their first night together, she shocked him. Some say love comes when you least expect it, while others believe it's just a game of chance. But for one isolated rancher, a simple wager would forever change the course of his solitary existence. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The year was 1883, and in the sun-baked heart of Abilene, Texas, dust settled on dreams as quickly as it did on the earth. The town had seen its share of hardship, but few stories would match the one beginning that scorching summer day. On the creaking porch of the town's only boarding house, Mary Johnson stood in her black widow's dress, her fingers nervously adjusting the worn fabric. She was oblivious to the wager that would soon change her life forever. Inside Dusty's saloon, the air hung heavy with tobacco smoke and broken promises. Robert Smith, whose ranch sprawled across the western hills, slammed down his empty whiskey glass, his voice cutting through the haze. "I'll marry the fat widow Johnson for 50 acres and your new stallion, Williams." His declaration was met with stunned silence before erupting into raucous laughter. Williams, a man known more for his gambling than his kindness, leaned forward with a predatory smile. "You'd saddle yourself with that woman just to win a bet? She's been mourning for months, barely speaks to anyone." "A woman's a woman," Robert replied, his words slurring slightly, "and her cooking's said to be decent. Better than coming home to an empty house every night." Sheriff John Davis, sitting quietly in the corner, shook his head but said nothing. The lawman had seen enough of men's cruelty to know intervention would only delay the inevitable. The next morning, Mary stood at the general store, counting pennies for flour. Her once fine dress had been altered repeatedly to accommodate her changing figure, a testament to grief's physical toll. When Robert approached, hat in hand, with an unexpected proposal, confusion crossed her face before understanding dawned. "I need a wife, Mrs. Johnson. You need security." His words were direct, emotionless. "I have a good ranch, plenty of food. You'd want for nothing." Mary's sister Sarah found her later, tears streaming down her face. "You can't seriously consider this, Mary. The man barely knows you. There must be another way." But 3 days later, the ink dried on a marriage certificate at the county clerk's office. Mary stood beside her new husband, her eyes flickering with both desperation and defiance. The small crowd of onlookers included Williams and his saloon companions, barely concealing their amusement at the unlikely pair. As Robert helped her into the wagon that would take her to her new home, Mary caught Sheriff Davis watching from across the street, concern etched in his weathered face. She straightened her back and lifted her chin. Whatever game these men thought they were playing, she had survived worse. And this time, she would not be the one to lose. Sheriff John Davis stood on the dusty boardwalk, his weathered hands resting on his belt as he watched the unlikely newlyweds depart. Mary Johnson, now Mary Smith, sat rigid beside Robert on the wagon bench, her black mourning dress a stark contrast against the golden prairie dust. The lawman shook his head slowly, 20 years of enforcing order in Abilene having shown him plenty of cruelty. But this wager struck him as particularly heartless. "Never seen a bet so mean-spirited," he muttered to himself as the wagon disappeared around the bend. Back at Dusty's saloon, the betting book had already filled with wagers on how long the union would last. Most gave her less than a month at the isolated Smith Ranch before she'd come crawling back to town, broken and humiliated. The sheriff had watched Mary's quiet dignity these past months, following her husband's death. The townspeople who'd once welcomed her with open arms now crossed the street to avoid her, their whispers following like shadows. Her late husband had gambled away everything they owned, leaving her with nothing but unpaid debts and a tarnished name. "Poor woman," muttered Hank Brown, who'd ridden into town for supplies. The old ranch hand had worked for Robert Smith for 15 years and knew better than most. What awaited the widow at the remote homestead? Smith ain't an easy man to live with on the best of days. What none of them truly understood, not the sheriff, not the snickering men at Dusty's, not even Robert himself, was the steel that ran through Mary's veins. Beneath her soft exterior and the extra weight that had become the subject of cruel jokes throughout Abilene beat the heart of a survivor. She had endured her first husband's slow descent into gambling addiction, had faced the creditors alone, had weathered the transformation from respected wife to pitied widow to social outcast. Sarah Johnson had begged her sister not to accept Robert's proposal, tears streaming down her face. There must be another way, she'd pleaded the night before the wedding. Mary had simply folded her hands in her lap, her voice steady. There isn't, but this isn't the end of my story, Sarah. It's merely a new chapter. As the wagon carrying the newlyweds faded into the horizon, Sheriff Davis couldn't have known that the woman everyone had written off as a victim had already begun calculating her own odds. And unlike the men who'd wagered against her at Dusty's, Mary had no intention of losing. The Smith Ranch rose on the horizon, a two-story house defiant against the emptiness of the Texas plains. The wooden structure stood tall against the backdrop of endless sky, neither grand nor humble, but bearing the weathered dignity of something that had survived against the odds. As Robert Smith's wagon rattled over the uneven trail, both passengers maintained a silence as vast as the landscape surrounding them. Mary Johnson's hands were folded primly in her lap, her widow's black dress absorbing the heat of the afternoon sun, but her mind was anything but still. Behind her composed expression, she was calculating, planning, preparing. This marriage, born of a cruel wager, would not define her future. She had survived her first husband's gambling addiction and the crushing debt he left behind. She would survive this too, perhaps even turn it to her advantage. "We'll be there before sundown," Robert finally spoke, his voice rough from disuse. He barely glanced at his new bride, focusing instead on guiding the horses through a particularly rutted section of trail. Mary nodded, studying his profile. The rancher was not an ugly man, but years of solitude had hardened his features, carved deep lines around his mouth. His reputation in Abilene preceded him. Never lost a bet, never backed down from a challenge, never opened his heart to anyone since losing family years ago. Back in town, the wager had spread like wildfire. Mary had felt the weight of stares as she gathered her few belongings from the boarding house. The townswomen whispered behind raised hands, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Storekeepers paused mid-transaction to watch her pass, wondering how long she would last at the isolated ranch with a man who had married her on a bet. Poor thing, she had overheard Mrs. Peterson murmur to the milliner, traded one misfortune for another. But Mary had moved through the streets with her head held high. Let them whisper, let them stare. They saw only what they expected to see, a desperate widow with limited prospects. None of them recognized the steel beneath her sadness, the determination that had carried her through worse trials than this. The wagon hit another bump, jostling them both. Robert steadied the reins with practiced hands. "There's a well behind the house," he said abruptly. "Water's good. You'll need to prime the kitchen pump most mornings." Mary took this information as what it was, not consideration, but instruction. "I understand," she replied, her voice steady. She would learn every inch of this ranch, every task required of her. And in time, Robert Smith would learn that he had wagered for far more than he realized. Sheriff John Davis leaned against the weathered post outside Abilene's only barbershop, his weathered face set in grim lines as Robert Smith emerged with freshly trimmed hair. The lawman had seen 20 years of frontier justice, but this wager struck him as particularly callous. "You're gambling with a woman's life, Smith. That's lower than betting a desperate man's last dollar," the sheriff said, his voice flat with warning. Robert adjusted his hat, squinting against the Texas sun. "A bet's a bet, Sheriff. She'll have food and a roof. Better than most widows here. His tone was matter-of-fact, as though discussing livestock rather than a marriage. Mary Johnson deserves better than being some saloon joke, Davis countered, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered revolver. The rancher merely shrugged. Town's been whispering about her since her husband died. At least at my place, she'll be away from the gossip. As Robert walked away, the sheriff shook his head, knowing the cruelty that could hide behind practical words. He'd seen too many women broken by such arrangements in frontier towns like Abilene. That afternoon, Robert stood stiffly on Mary's porch at the boarding house, hat in hand. The widow opened the door, her black dress hanging loosely on her frame, eyes wary, but chin lifted with dignity that surprised him. "Johnson," he began awkwardly, "I've come to make you a proposition." A flicker of something, resignation perhaps, crossed her face. "Mr. Smith, let's speak plainly." "I'm offering marriage," he said bluntly. "My ranch needs a woman's touch, and you need security," she finished for him, her voice steady. "I know about the bet with Mr. Williams at Dusty's. The whole town knows." Robert's face flushed beneath his tan. He hadn't expected such directness. Mary stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind her. "I accept, on one condition. Never speak of how this marriage came to be. Not to me, not to others. The arrangement begins and ends with that silence." Her eyes held his, neither pleading nor angry, simply determined. Robert found himself nodding, surprised by the steel beneath her soft exterior. "We'll marry tomorrow, then," he said, replacing his hat. "Tomorrow," she agreed, and something in her calm acceptance made Robert wonder, briefly, if he'd underestimated the widow Johnson. As he walked away, Mary watched his retreating figure, her hand clutching the doorframe. This wasn't the marriage she'd dreamed of as a girl, but dreams had died with her first husband's gambling debts. This time, she'd make different choices. The ceremony was over in minutes. No flowers adorned the small courthouse, no well-wishers lined the steps. Only the scratching of Judge Parker's pen as he recorded their union punctuated the silence. Mary Johnson, now Mary Smith, smoothed her black dress, the same one she'd worn to her first husband's funeral just 7 months prior. The irony wasn't lost on her. Outside, Sarah Johnson waited, her face a mixture of worry and fierce determination. Unlike her older sister, Sarah had never learned to hide her emotions behind a placid expression. She pressed a small cloth-wrapped bundle into Mary's hands. "Our mother's recipes and her wedding handkerchief," Sarah whispered, her voice catching, "and some dried herbs for tea when you can't sleep." She leaned closer, gripping Mary's wrist with surprising strength. "Don't let him break you, Mary. Whatever happens out there, remember who you are." Mary nodded, tucking the bundle into her small traveling bag. "I survived Thomas and his gambling. I'll survive Robert Smith and his pride." The sisters embraced briefly, both aware of the stares from townspeople pretending not to watch. As Mary climbed onto the wagon beside her new husband, the sound of approaching footsteps and male laughter made her stomach tighten. Williams led the small group of saloon patrons, their faces flushed with midday whiskey and cruel amusement. "There goes the blushing bride," Williams called out, tipping his hat mockingly. "Smith, you old dog, 50 acres for that bargain? I'd have given you 60. The men roared with laughter. One mimicked the strain of wagon wheels under weight, while another made exaggerated kissing sounds. Robert's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, simply flicking the reins to set the horses in motion. Mary felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her gaze fixed straight ahead. She had weathered worse storms than these drunken fools. The townswomen's whispers had cut deeper than any man's jeers ever could. Sheriff John Davis stood at the corner, watching with disapproval etched into his weathered face. As the wagon passed, he nodded slightly to Mary, a small gesture of respect that she tucked away like a precious coin. The wagon wheels creaked as they left Abilene behind, dust rising in their wake. Mary's hands were folded in her lap, her wedding ring, a plain band Robert had purchased that morning, feeling foreign and heavy on her finger. She glanced at her husband's profile, stern and unyielding as the Texas landscape around them. He had won his bet, but Mary had survived her first husband's drinking, gambling, and eventual death. She had endured the town's judgment when Thomas's debts were revealed. The Smith Ranch might be remote and her new husband cold, but Mary had weathered worse storms than this one. She would survive. The wagon wheels creaked beneath them as Robert Smith and Mary Johnson traveled the dusty trail toward their new life together. Neither spoke a word during the journey. The only sounds were the horses' steady breathing and the occasional call of a distant hawk. Mary clutched her small bundle of possessions in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon where her future waited. As the setting sun painted the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and reds, the Smith Ranch finally appeared in the distance. The two-story structure stood proud against the emptiness of the plains, a testament to Robert's years of hard work. Mary straightened her back and lifted her chin, silently promising herself that this arrangement, born of a cruel wager, would not break her spirit. "There it is," Robert muttered, the first words he'd spoken in hours. Home. The wagon rolled to a stop in the yard, and he climbed down without offering Mary assistance. She gathered her skirts and descended carefully, taking in the weathered porch, the sturdy barn to the right, and the vast emptiness surrounding them. This isolation was both a threat and an opportunity. "Come on," he said gruffly, carrying her trunk toward the house. "Night's coming." Inside, the ranch house was solid but sparse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, cold ashes telling of fires long extinguished. Bare wooden floors stretched beneath their feet, worn smooth by years of use. The walls, once whitewashed, had yellowed with age and neglect. "Kitchen's through there," Robert explained, gesturing toward a doorway. His voice was flat, businesslike. "Pump works most days. Pantry's got basics. My room's upstairs at the end of the hall. You can take the one opposite." Mary nodded, noting how he recited these facts as if reading terms from a contract rather than welcoming a bride. Her eyes were drawn to the only decoration in the room, a stern portrait of an older man with Robert's jawline, likely his father, watching disapprovingly from above the mantel. "Breakfast at sunrise," he continued. "I'm in the fields or with the herd most days. Hank and the boys stay in the bunkhouse, but they come for lunch." Mary absorbed every word, cataloging information she would need to survive. The house echoed with emptiness, not just the absence of furnishings, but of warmth, of conversation, of life itself. Yet beneath the loneliness, she sensed potential. This barren house could become something more. "I understand," she said simply, her first words since they'd left town. Robert seemed surprised by her voice, as if he'd forgotten she could speak. He nodded awkwardly and headed toward the door. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything." That first night, Mary Johnson sat alone at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the worn grain of wood that had witnessed countless solitary meals. The oil lamp cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the stark reality of her new home. She took careful inventory of her surroundings, noting every detail with the practiced eye of a woman accustomed to making do. The pantry held only the barest essentials: flour with weevils, dried beans, and salt pork hanging from a hook. Not even enough to last 2 weeks for a proper household. The cast-iron stove stood like a battle-scarred sentinel, its surface pitted from years of neglect. When Mary attempted to draw water, the pump by the sink protested with a screech that echoed through the empty house, as if announcing her presence to the wilderness beyond. 3 attempts yielded barely enough water to fill her washing basin. She scrubbed her hands until they were raw, washing away the dust of travel, but not the weight of her circumstances. Upstairs, Robert had shown her to a sparse bedroom with a narrow bed. "You'll sleep here," he had stated flatly, before retreating to his own quarters down the hall. No pretense of a marriage bed, which suited Mary fine. She had entered this arrangement with clear eyes, shelter and security in exchange for her labor. Romance had never been part of the bargain. As darkness deepened, she unpacked the small bundle her sister Sarah had pressed into her hands. Inside lay a hand-stitched quilt, a family heirloom that had survived 2 generations and 3 moves west. Mary spread it across the thin mattress, a small comfort in this strange place. Beneath it, she found a folded note. "Remember who you are. You've weathered worse storms." Sleep came fitfully, broken by unfamiliar creaks of the house settling and distant coyote calls. Mary lay awake, planning her approach to the coming days, calculating how to transform this cold arrangement into something she could not just endure, but master. Dawn arrived with the heavy thud of boots on the porch boards. Through the small window, she watched her husband stride toward the barn without a backward glance at the house. The widow rose quickly, splashing cold water on her face and pinning her hair into a practical bun. If Robert expected to return to the same neglected house, he would soon learn his error. Mary dressed in her plainest skirt and shirtwaist, rolling up her sleeves as she descended the stairs. She would claim this territory inch by inch, starting with the kitchen. By the time the sun crowned the eastern pastures, she had already begun the transformation that would eventually reshape not just the ranch house, but the very nature of the bet that had brought her here. Mary Johnson rose before dawn, determined to claim the kitchen as her domain. Years of neglect had left every surface coated with a stubborn layer of grease and grime. She rolled up her sleeves and attacked the cast-iron stove first, scrubbing until her knuckles bled. The kitchen became her battlefield. Each pot and pan she scoured was a small victory, each clean surface a territory claimed. Mary worked methodically, her movements purposeful as she cleared away the evidence of a bachelor's indifference. Outside, the Texas sun crept over the horizon, painting the Smith Ranch in hues of amber and gold. By the time the first ranch hand's boots crunched on the gravel outside, her hands were raw and red, but the kitchen gleamed with an attention it hadn't seen in years. The worn wooden table had been scrubbed until the grain showed through, and the windows, once clouded with dust, now welcomed the morning light. Mary wiped her brow with the back of her wrist and turned her attention to breakfast. She found eggs in the henhouse, bacon hanging in the smokehouse, and flour in a nearly empty bin. With practiced movements, she mixed biscuit dough, her fingers working quickly despite their tenderness. The smell of bacon soon filled the kitchen, driving away the lingering scent of lye soap. When Robert Smith returned from his morning chores, he paused at the doorway, momentarily taken aback by the transformation. The widow stood by the stove, her black dress dusted with flour, her face flushed from the heat. Before him lay a spread that would have impressed even the finest establishments in Abilene: golden biscuits, perfectly fried eggs, and bacon crisp at the edges, but tender in the middle. The coffee steamed in a pot that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, now polished to a dull shine. "Breakfast," Mary said simply, gesturing to the table. Robert sat without a word, his weathered hands reaching for the food. His eyes widened slightly at the first taste. The biscuits light and fluffy, the coffee strong enough to sear away the morning fatigue. He ate methodically, his expression guarded, but his appetite honest. The rancher maintained his silence throughout the meal, offering neither complaint nor compliment. Yet his plate told the story his lips wouldn't, cleaned of every morsel, a tiny surrender in their silent war. When he finished, he pushed back from the table and stood, pausing only briefly before heading back out to the fields. Mary watched him go, her chin lifting slightly. In the quiet of the kitchen, she allowed herself a small smile. The first battle had been fought and won. This marriage might have begun as a cruel wager, but she would ensure it became something neither Robert nor the gossiping townspeople ever expected. The ranch hands eyed Mary Johnson warily when she appeared at the barn with lunch. She'd packed a basket with cornbread and beans, determined to establish herself beyond the confines of the house. These men, weathered by sun and labor, stood awkwardly as she approached, their hats suddenly fascinating objects in their calloused hands. They were unaccustomed to a woman's presence in their domain. They shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that spoke volumes without words. "Thought you might be hungry," Mary said, setting the basket down on a hay bale. The silence stretched until old Hank Brown finally tipped his hat and muttered, "Mrs. Smith." His acknowledgement broke the tension, and the others nodded in turn, though none quite met her eyes. "Been working since dawn," she continued, uncovering the food. "No sense waiting until supper to eat something substantial." The men approached cautiously, like wary animals unsure of a new watering hole. Mary noticed how they deferred to Hank, whose lined face had softened slightly at the smell of fresh cornbread. As they ate, she observed them. 4 men whose lives were bound to this land as surely as Robert's was. They spoke little, but their grateful nods told her what their words didn't. When Robert appeared at the barn entrance, his expression darkened momentarily at finding his wife among his workers. Mary met his gaze steadily, refusing to be cowed. After a tense moment, he simply turned and walked away, leaving her victory uncontested. By week's end, Mary had mapped the house's every flaw in her mind. The sagging porch step that would need replacing before winter, the kitchen window that stuck when humidity rose, the loose floorboard in the upstairs hallway that announced every midnight journey. She ran her fingers along the walls, feeling the solid construction beneath years of neglect. The house, sturdy but abandoned to time and indifference, mirrored the closed-off man who owned it. Built with care, then left to weather alone, it held potential that no one had bothered to nurture. In the parlor, dust-covered surfaces that might have hosted gatherings. The dining room table, large enough for a family, had clearly known only solitary meals for years. Each evening, as Robert returned from the fields, Mary watched him move through the spaces she'd begun to claim. His shoulders would relax almost imperceptibly when he entered rooms she'd cleaned, though he never commented on the changes. Like the house, he was solid but neglected, resistant yet responding to care despite himself. Each night, Mary wrote to her sister by lamplight, her fingers cramped from the day's labor but determined to maintain this one connection to her former life. The small desk by the window became her sanctuary after Robert retreated to his room. She dipped her pen carefully, conscious of the cost of ink in these remote parts. "The ranch is bigger than I expected," she penned, choosing her words with care. "Mr. Smith keeps to himself, which is fine. I have plans that would shock them all in town." Mary paused, nearly writing about the emptiness that threatened to consume her in the quiet hours, but instead described the north pasture and her ideas for it. Sarah didn't need to carry the weight of her loneliness, too. The letters never mentioned how Mary sometimes stood at the window, watching Robert move between barn and bunkhouse, wondering if they would ever speak more than 10 words in sequence. They certainly didn't reveal how she'd memorized the creaking floorboards, the way the wind whistled through the kitchen window, or how she sometimes spoke aloud just to hear a human voice. On the second Sunday after her arrival at Smith Ranch, Mary rose before dawn. She heated water for a proper bath, scrubbing away the week's work until her skin glowed pink. From her trunk, she extracted her best dress, navy blue with modest lace at the collar, saved from her previous life. The fabric, slightly tight across her middle, reminded her of the townspeople's whispers, but she squared her shoulders and pinned her hair neatly. Bible in hand, Mary waited by the wagon as the morning sun quested the horizon. When Robert emerged from the barn, he stopped short, taking in her appearance with evident surprise. "Church wasn't part of the arrangement," he grunted, adjusting his hat. Mary clutched her Bible tighter. "I've attended services every Sunday since I was a child. I don't intend to stop now." The rancher's jaw worked silently, clearly calculating the town's reaction to their appearance, or her appearance alone. Mary didn't wait for his decision. With practiced determination, she climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. "You're welcome to join me," she offered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. or I can return the wagon by noon." Robert stared at her, the silence stretching between them like the dusty road to town. For a moment, Mary thought he might forbid her to go, assert his authority as both husband and wagon owner. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and walked toward the house, leaving her to choose, wait or go alone. Mary snapped the reins, the wagon lurching forward. As dust billowed behind her, she permitted herself a small smile. This marriage may have begun as a bet, but she would not be a passive participant in her own life. Mary Johnson entered the small white church alone, her steps measured and deliberate. Every head turned as she walked down the narrow aisle, her Sunday dress smoothed carefully over her frame. She kept her chin high, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of whispers that followed her like shadows. The pews creaked as people shifted to stare, their judgment barely concealed behind hymn books and fans. Reverend Peterson's gaze lingered on Mary as he announced the morning's sermon topic, the sacred covenant of marriage. His emphasis on sacred and covenant felt pointed, each word landing like a stone. Throughout his passionate discourse on matrimonial duty and divine purpose, his eyes repeatedly found her in the congregation. The message was unmistakable. The town viewed her union with Robert Smith as nothing short of mockery of the institution itself. Mary sat perfectly still, her face a careful mask of serenity that betrayed none of the storm within. She had weathered her late husband's gambling and the town's subsequent disdain. She could weather this too. When the collection plate passed, she placed a coin in it with steady hands, the small clink echoing her defiance. As the congregation spilled onto the church steps after the service, conversations halted abruptly when Mary approached. Women who had chatted animatedly moments before suddenly found their handkerchiefs fascinating, while men cleared their throats and looked toward the distant horizon. "Mary," Sarah Johnson's voice cut through the awkward silence as she pushed through the crowd. Her younger sister embraced her warmly, whispering, "You look well. Is he treating you decently?" Before Mary could answer, Mrs. Thompson, the storekeeper's wife, approached with a rigid smile that never reached her eyes. "Mrs. Smith," she said, the new surname sounding like an accusation on her lips. "We missed you at last week's auxiliary meeting." "I wasn't aware there was one," Mary replied evenly. "Well," Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice brittle as dried twigs, "we meet every Thursday at 3. You're welcome to join us, of course." The invitation hung in the air between them, less an offer of friendship than a challenge, a test Mary was expected to fail. Sarah squeezed her sister's hand supportively as other women watched the exchange, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Mary recognized the look. They were waiting for her to crumble, to confirm their suspicions that she was merely a desperate woman who had accepted a loveless arrangement. Instead, she smiled graciously. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I look forward to Thursday then." Her voice carried across the church steps, steady and clear as a bell on a still morning. Sheriff John Davis leaned against the hitching post outside the general store, watching Mary Johnson as she carefully arranged burlap sacks of flour and sugar in her wagon. The mid-morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty street as townspeople moved about their business, occasionally glancing at the new Mrs. Smith with poorly concealed curiosity. "How are things out at the ranch, Mrs. Smith?" the sheriff asked, his weathered face showing genuine concern beneath the brim of his hat. "Robert can be a hard man." Mary looked up, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. Her hands were stronger now, marked by calluses from weeks of ranch work. The sheriff noticed how she carried herself differently, straighter, more assured, than the grieving widow who had left town 6 weeks ago. "Mr. Smith and I have an understanding, Sheriff," she replied, her smile small but steady. "I'm exactly where I choose to be." Her words carried beyond their conversation, reaching the ears of the storekeeper's wife, who lingered nearby, pretending to sweep the boardwalk. Mary was declaring her position to the entire town. She was no one's victim. Davis shifted uncomfortably, his boots scuffing the dirt. Williams and his friends are still running their mouths about that wager. Just thought you should know. Let 'em talk, Mary said, securing the last of her supplies with a firm tug on the ropes. Men like that only understand the world in terms of what they can win or lose. The lawman nodded slowly, impressed by her composure. Your sister asks after you whenever I ride past her place. Says you write regularly, but don't say much about how you're really faring. Mary's expression softened at the mention of Sarah. My sister worries too much. Always has. She paused, considering her next words carefully. The ranch is teaching me things about myself I never knew, Sheriff. And perhaps about Robert Smith as well. A group of men emerged from the saloon across the street, Williams among them. They fell silent upon noticing Mary, their earlier laughter dying on their lips. Need any help getting back to Smith Ranch? Davis offered, eyeing the men warily. Mary climbed confidently onto the wagon seat and took up the reins. Thank you, but I can manage. She looked directly at Williams and his companions before turning back to the sheriff. The betting men might be surprised to learn that some wagers pay off in unexpected ways. As she guided the wagon down the main street, Mary's back remained straight, her gaze fixed forward. The sheriff watched her go, a new respect in his eyes for the woman who had transformed a cruel bet into something resembling dignity, perhaps even strength. Mary Johnson approached the small white church annex with a basket of freshly baked apple bread. The ladies' auxiliary meeting had been marked on the town bulletin board for 3 o'clock sharp, and she had spent the morning preparing her contribution. As she neared the building, voices and laughter drifted through the open windows. When she knocked on the door, silence fell instantly. Through the lace curtains, Mary could see the women frozen in place, teacups suspended midair, their eyes widening at her silhouette. After an uncomfortable pause, Mrs. Peterson, the Reverend's wife, appeared at the door with a tight smile. Oh my, Mary, there's been a misunderstanding. The meeting was postponed until next week. Didn't anyone tell you? Behind her, Mary glimpsed the full table of women, plates of cookies, and steaming teapots. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her voice steady. It seems the message didn't reach me. My apologies for interrupting. As she turned to leave, Mrs. Peterson called after her. We'll be sure to send word next time. The door closed quickly, followed by hushed whispers and a burst of poorly concealed laughter. Mary walked back toward the general store, her basket heavy in her hands, her back straight despite the humiliation. She was arranging to purchase fabric when Sarah Johnson burst through the door, her face flushed with anger. "I just heard what they did," Sarah said, pulling her sister aside. "Elizabeth Williams told me they deliberately changed the date without notifying you." Her eyes flashed with protective fury. And that's not all they're saying. They're claiming Robert only married you because no one else would have you, and that he's too ashamed to bring you to town functions. Mary continued examining bolts of calico and gingham, her fingers assessing the quality with practiced care. The blue would make fine curtains for the front parlor, she remarked, seemingly unmoved by the gossip. And perhaps the yellow for the kitchen. "Mary, did you hear what I said?" Sarah pressed, bewildered by her sister's calm. Mary finally looked up, her eyes clear and determined as she selected several yards of fabric. "Let them talk, Sarah. What matters isn't what they think now." She paid the storekeeper and gathered her purchases. "What matters is what they'll think when I'm finished." As they stepped onto the boardwalk, Mary handed her untouched basket to a thin-faced woman with 3 small children. The woman's grateful smile was worth more than any auxiliary tea. Mary turned toward the wagon, her mind already mapping the transformation she would bring to the lonely ranch house and its equally lonely owner. The ride back to the ranch stretched long and dusty, the wagon wheels cutting through the parched earth as Mary Johnson stared ahead. The women's cold reception at the auxiliary meeting had stung, but it wasn't the first time she'd faced such treatment. The widow squared her shoulders against the memory of those lace curtains and turned faces. She had weathered her late husband's gambling debts, the shame of near destitution, and now this loveless marriage. The town's whispers were merely another storm to endure. As the Smith Ranch appeared on the horizon, Mary's mind raced with possibilities rather than regrets. The property, for all its neglect, held potential that Robert seemed blind to. She guided the horse toward the house, her gaze drawn to the expanse of unused land stretching northward. The following morning, while Robert rode out with his hands to check the herd, Mary tied on a worn bonnet and walked the boundaries of the property. Her practical boots crunched over brittle grass until she reached the abandoned north pasture. Kneeling, she scooped a handful of soil, letting it sift through her fingers. Dry, yes, but not dead. Not beyond saving. The texture reminded her of the small farm where she'd grown up, where her father had taught her and Sarah about crop rotation and soil health, when other girls were learning needlepoint. "Land speaks if you listen," he'd always said. Mary closed her eyes, remembering the smell of clover fields and how they'd transformed their failing soil. That evening, as Robert sat at the kitchen table reviewing his accounts, Mary placed a plate of hot biscuits beside him, a silent offering before her proposition. The rancher looked up, surprise briefly crossing his weathered face at the unexpected gesture. "The north pasture isn't beyond saving," she said, her voice steady as she poured him coffee. "The soil there is tired, not dead. My father always used clover to bring life back to exhausted land." Robert's pen paused mid-calculation. "Your father taught you farming?" The question carried disbelief, though less mockery than she'd expected. "My father had no sons," Mary replied simply, meeting his gaze without apology. "He taught me everything he knew about land management." The silence between them stretched, filled only with the ticking of the kitchen clock and the distant lowing of cattle. She'd stepped beyond the boundaries of their arrangement, offering knowledge instead of just service. Mary waited, hands folded before her, as Robert studied her face, searching, perhaps, for the woman he'd dismissed when making that cruel bet at Dusty's saloon. Tomorrow would reveal if he'd listen or dismiss her. But tonight, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Mary felt the ground beneath her feet was truly her own. Robert's eyebrow arched high, genuine surprise crossing his weathered face. The evening shadows stretched across the ranch house's kitchen as Mary explained her agricultural knowledge with quiet confidence. "Your father taught you farming?" he asked, his tone betraying disbelief despite his attempt to mask it. Robert Smith had never known women to concern themselves with crop rotation or soil management. In his experience, ranching was men's work, plain and simple. Mary Johnson stood her ground, hands resting firmly on the worn wooden table between them. "My father had no sons," she answered, holding his gaze without flinching. "He taught me everything he knew about working the land. The north pasture needs nitrogen back in the soil. Clover will fix what cattle have taken." The silence between them stretched, filled only with the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the distant lowing of cattle. Robert studied his wife's face, searching for uncertainty, but finding none. The lamplight caught the determination in her eyes, the same determination that had carried her through widowhood, through the town's contempt, and now through this marriage of convenience. He nodded once, abruptly, before turning away. No further words passed between them that night. Mary retired to her room, wondering if her suggestion had fallen on deaf ears, her mind already planning alternative approaches to prove her worth beyond the kitchen. Dawn broke with golden fingers stretching across the Texas plains. Mary rose early as always, her routine of preparing breakfast already second nature after weeks at the ranch. As she stepped onto the porch with her first cup of coffee, something caught her eye near the barn. There, propped against the water trough, sat a burlap sack. Beside it stood a wooden stake with a red cloth tied at its top, marking the corner of a plot in the north pasture, exactly where she had suggested planting. Mary approached slowly, setting down her cup to lift the heavy sack. Inside, clover seeds filled it nearly to bursting. No note accompanied this silent permission. No verbal acknowledgement would likely come, but the gesture spoke volumes about the shifting ground beneath their arrangement. Robert had listened. More importantly, he had valued her knowledge enough to act on it. Hank Brown nodded respectfully as he passed her on his way to the barn. "Morning, Mrs. Smith. Looks like you got yourself a project now." Mary smiled, her first genuine smile in weeks. "Indeed I do, Hank." She tested the weight of the seed sack, already calculating how far it would stretch across the marked plot. By mid-morning, when Robert rode out to check the western fence line, Mary was already turning soil with a determination that matched the Texas sun for intensity. The soil crumbled between Mary's fingers as she knelt in the north pasture. After weeks of toil, her hands had grown calloused, matching the determination that had taken root within her. The clover seeds she'd planted were beginning to transform the abandoned field into something promising. Mary Johnson wiped sweat from her brow, her dress now fitting differently as her body changed with the daily labor. She worked methodically, row by row, humming at first, then breaking into the folk songs her father had taught her as a child. Her voice carried across the Texas plains, a melody that seemed to breathe life into the parched earth. The songs spoke of perseverance and hope, themes that resonated deeply with her current circumstances. From the corner of her eye, Mary noticed old Hank Brown pausing by the fence. The weathered ranch hand leaned against the wooden post, hat in hand, listening. When their eyes met, he nodded respectfully before continuing toward the barn. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. The first sign of genuine regard she'd received since arriving at Smith Ranch. Word of Mary's farming experiment traveled quickly to Abilene. The townspeople who had whispered behind her back now found fresh fodder for their gossip. Some expressed disbelief that Robert would allow his bet-one wife to attempt something so ambitious. Others placed wagers of their own on how quickly she would fail. At Dusty's saloon, Williams cornered Robert one evening, whiskey emboldening his tongue. "Bet that fat wife of yours quits before anything sprouts," he sneered, loud enough for the other patrons to hear. "Seems you got yourself more trouble than that 50 acres was worth." The saloon fell silent as Robert's hand shot out, gripping Williams by the collar. His knuckles whitened as he pulled the man close. "Speak of my wife that way again," Robert said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and you'll need more than the sheriff to save you." The unexpected defense stunned the onlookers. Robert himself seemed surprised by his reaction as he released Williams and strode out, leaving his drink untouched on the counter. When he returned to the ranch that night, Robert stood at the edge of the field Mary had claimed. In the moonlight, he could make out the faint green haze of new growth. He watched as she emerged from the house to check on her plants one last time before bed, unaware of his presence or how he had defended her honor hours earlier. For the first time since their arrangement began, Robert wondered if perhaps he wasn't the winner of the bet after all. 6 weeks after planting, Mary Johnson's experiment transformed the north pasture into a carpet of tender green clover shoots. Each morning, she walked the perimeter, watching life return to soil that Robert had long abandoned. The vibrant patch stood in stark contrast to the surrounding drought-stressed land, drawing attention from everyone at Smith Ranch. Hank Brown was the first of the ranch hands to approach her about more than just the crops. The old cowboy removed his hat, twisting it nervously in weathered hands as he asked if she knew anything for easing joint pain. Mary smiled, remembering her grandmother's remedies, and promised him a salve by sundown. Word spread quickly among the men. By week's end, 3 more had sought her counsel. One for a festering saddle sore, another for sleeplessness, and young Tim for a letter to his sweetheart that needed a woman's touch. Mary helped them all, her kitchen becoming a place of healing and quiet conversation. "Never seen the boys take to anyone like they've taken to you," Robert remarked one evening, watching from the doorway as she bottled willow bark tea for Hank's arthritis. Mary looked up, surprised by both his presence and the observation. "People respond to being treated with respect," she replied, her hands never pausing in their work. In town, the whispers had changed tone. Sarah reported that Williams had lost $20, betting that Mary would have fled back to town by now. Even Reverend Peterson had mentioned the remarkable transformation at Smith Ranch during Sunday's sermon, though Mary hadn't been present to hear it. Sheriff Davis tipped his hat to her with genuine warmth when she came for supplies. "That north pasture of yours is visible from the road now," he said. "Greenest spot in the county." "It's just the beginning," Mary answered, a quiet confidence in her voice that hadn't been there before. The most significant change, however, was in Robert himself. She would catch him watching her from across the fields, his expression unreadable but intent. He began asking her opinion on ranch matters, first about the crops, then about cattle rotation, finally about which hands deserved wage increases. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Mary stood at the edge of her flourishing pasture. She felt Robert's presence before she heard his footsteps. "My father would have said you have a gift," he offered, standing beside her, without touching. "Not a gift," Mary corrected gently. "Just knowledge that comes from caring about something." Robert nodded, and for the first time, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than strained. The woman who had arrived as nothing more than the subject of a cruel wager had become essential to the ranch's survival, and perhaps to something more. The summer heat descended on Abilene like a punishment from above. Day after merciless day, the sun baked the earth until it cracked like old leather. Mary Smith stood at the kitchen window, watching dust devils dance across the yard while the ranch hands moved sluggishly between chores, their shirts dark with sweat. The creek that cut through the eastern edge of Smith Ranch had dwindled to a trickle, barely enough to wet a horse's fetlock. Mary noticed Robert's absence at supper and, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill, followed the path down to the water's edge. She found him there, boots planted in the dry mud where water should have flowed, his broad shoulders slumped in a way she'd never seen before. The setting sun cast long shadows across his features, deepening the lines of worry etched there. "Last time it was this dry, we lost half the herd," Robert admitted without turning, his voice rough with concern. 3 years of work, gone in 2 months. Mary stepped closer, her skirts brushing against the parched grass. This vulnerability was the first real crack in his arbor, a glimpse of the man beneath the hard exterior she'd married. "My father dug catchment basins along the low points of our property," she offered, standing beside him now. "Connected them with shallow trenches that directed what little rain we got. It saved us once during the drought of '76. Robert turned to look at her, really look at her, perhaps for the first time. "Your father taught you well." "Necessity teaches better than any schoolroom," Mary replied, her voice soft but steady. "We could start tomorrow, while there's still moisture in the ground." They walked back to the house together, not touching but somehow closer than they'd been since the day of their hasty wedding. The distance between them had narrowed with each shared hardship. Later that night, as Mary wiped down the kitchen table, she noticed something glinting in the lamplight. A small silver locket lay beside her plate, its chain coiled like a tiny snake. With trembling fingers, she opened it to find a portrait of a young woman with Robert's eyes, holding a small boy of perhaps 3 years. Hank had mentioned once, in passing, that the rancher had lost his sister and her son to fever years back. This silent offering, this sharing of grief, spoke volumes that Robert Smith couldn't say aloud. Mary closed the locket gently and pressed it to her heart before slipping it into her pocket. Tomorrow she would wear it as she helped him dig the basins that might save their livelihood. Tomorrow they would face the drought together. The summer heat bore down mercilessly on Smith Ranch as the creek dwindled to little more than a muddy trickle. Each day, Mary Johnson walked the property, checking soil and counting cattle with the practiced eye of a farmer's daughter. The drought had turned the once promising pastures into brittle stretches of yellow, and even the hardy Texas longhorns lowed plaintively at empty water troughs. Inside the ranch house, the atmosphere grew as parched as the land. Robert spent longer hours in the fields, returning with deepening lines around his eyes. Mary noticed how he'd stopped complaining about her meddling in ranch affairs. Now, he actively sought her counsel on water conservation and feed rationing. One evening, after the ranch hands had retired to their quarters, Mary carried a lamp toward the study, balancing a plate of cornbread and beans. The door stood ajar, spilling lamplight into the hallway. She paused at the threshold, watching her husband. Robert sat slumped over his worn ledger, one hand buried in his hair, the other gripping a pencil that had stopped moving across the page. "You need to eat," Mary said, setting the plate beside him. He didn't look up. "What good's food when we've got no money to buy feed come winter?" Mary leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the columns of figures. The drought had driven up hay prices across 3 counties, and their reserves wouldn't last another month. The cattle would fetch only a fraction of their worth at market, thin as they were. "The Browns asked about our east section again last Sunday," she said carefully, her finger tracing the edge of the ledger. "That land's always been better for crops than cattle anyway." Robert's head snapped up. "My father worked 7 years to buy that parcel." "And he'd work 7 more to save this ranch," Mary countered, her voice steady. "We could sell the east section to the Browns. It'll see us through." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant howl of a coyote. Mary didn't push. She'd learned when to let Robert wrestle with his pride. Finally, he looked up at her, really looked at her, his eyes no longer seeing the widow he'd married on a cruel bet, but the woman who'd transformed his home, his land, and though he couldn't yet admit it, his heart. "You know ranching better than most men born to it," he said quietly. Mary smiled slightly. "My father always said wisdom doesn't care who carries it." Robert nodded slowly, then reached for her hand. The touch was brief but deliberate, his calloused fingers rough against her work-hardened palm. In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition that what had begun as obligation had become partnership, forged in the crucible of hardship and mutual respect. The orange glow on the horizon appeared without warning. A wildfire, sparked by a careless traveler's abandoned campfire, now raced toward Smith Ranch with terrifying speed. The drought-stricken land offered perfect kindling, and the hot summer wind pushed flames faster than a galloping horse. "Get to town now," Robert Smith shouted, thrusting the reins of his wagon into Mary's hands. His face, illuminated by the distant blaze, was rigid with fear, not for himself, but for her. Mary handed the reins back. "I'm staying," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Before Robert could protest, she was already moving toward the house, with purpose in every step. Inside, Mary worked with swift precision, breaking open jars of preserved fruit and emptying water barrels. "We'll dig a trench and soak it," she instructed the ranch hands who'd gathered. "The fire can't jump what it can't burn." When the shout came that 2 hands were trapped in the east pasture, Robert prepared to ride out. Mary was faster. She mounted his prize stallion, the very animal that had been part of the wager that brought her here, and galloped toward the wall of flame before anyone could stop her. Through smoke and cinder she rode, the stallion responding to her confident hands as if they'd been partners for years. She found the men, disoriented and coughing, and guided them back through a narrow corridor of safety that was closing by the second. The night became an endless battle. Mary worked alongside the men, her dress scorched and her face blackened with soot. She directed water lines, helped dig fire breaks, and kept the animals from panicking with a calm authority that no one thought to question. By dawn, when the fire had finally been turned away from the main buildings, Mary's strength finally gave out. She sank onto the porch steps, her hands raw and blistered, her breathing shallow with exhaustion. Robert found her there as the sun rose. He stood silently, taking in the sight of this woman, this remarkable, indomitable woman whom he had once reduced to nothing more than the butt of a cruel wager. The ranch house still stood. The barn was intact. His livelihood survived because of her. Hank approached, his weathered face solemn with respect. "Never seen anything like it," the old ranch hand said quietly. "Mrs. Smith saved us all." Robert nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. As Mary slept, her face peaceful despite the smudges of ash, a profound realization settled in his heart. The bet that Williams had proposed in Dusty's saloon had not cost him his pride as he'd feared. Instead, it had brought him the greatest prize he could never have imagined: a partner whose strength matched his own, and a love that had been forged, like steel, in the hottest of fires.